Hello everybody and welcome back to another Ashes of Creation video. Now today I wanted to talk about the inevitability of server merging. Of course, when the game releases there will be a large player base that tries it out for the first time and the concurrent player base will slowly dwindle. That's natural, that happens with every game, but because this is a grand scale MMO in which the player themselves have such a large impact into the world, what does that mean for having to merge servers or possibly close down servers? Well, anybody who's played an MMO knows kind of what happens across that. Essentially, a server gets shut down and a player base either merges into another server or sometimes maybe they can pick their own server that they want to move into. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but I think the way that Ashes of Creation is going and moving forward is they want to have a story across everything the player does. You as the player impact your own story and the story of the world. So how can they incorporate these ideals into server merging? And I've got a couple of concepts. So overall, a concept for me should be that there is a story element to a server's shutdown. The game is about creating the history, as I've said before. You know, if players are to lose their land and what they've built, don't just shut it down and just let them move on. Give them a story and give them a reason as to why their land has been taken over or is no longer there anymore. Now, in order to explain my concept, I'm going to have to go into the history of the game and how it's going to start. So the start of the game is all about surviving an apocalypse event. Your ancestors have evacuated through the divine gates, and that's where the journey will start, is when you return from those divine gates. You come out to basically a completely new world that has absolutely no civilization and nothing to it, and your job is to build the world. So if we use that concept to think about how a server could shut down from a story element, I would like to see another apocalypse type event that players can interact with, and here's a few ideas on how that could be possible. Now, before I continue, I do need to mention that whilst I was doing research on how server merging may work in the future, there was actually another user who had a very similar concept, and I think it's only fair to really call them out. On the forum, they're known as Quicksilver, and really a lot of their concept is quite similar to mine, and I really appreciated that other players across the entire community had very similar thoughts and have their own way of looking at certain things, and I'm glad I'm not the only person who thinks that. One, this is already a great idea, and two, that more and more people actually want to see something like this. Now, I also have to caveat that, of course, this is during the event of a server shutting down, so it doesn't mean that this is going to be an experience that every single player will have. But that's also not a defense to not do it, in my personal opinion. At the end of the day, if you think that every single player is going to experience every aspect of a game like Ashes of Creation, you're crazy. And if you manage to do it, fair play, that's just not going to happen. I really don't care what anyone says. You're not going to experience everything across the game, so that argument's out the window. Now, I'm going to look at two different scenarios for this. We're going to start off in the lore as some sort of prophecy about the end of the world. The end of the world has already happened, but you managed to survive it. So, could the prophecy itself not have actually been for that element? Could it be for this server shutdown? Again, in current worlds and worlds that are not going to be shutting down, the prophecy is still there, and it could very much be the prophecy just meant the end of the world at the start of the game. But in a server that's shutting down, that prophecy could come true once again, thus giving more of a history and element to that. Now, one of the concepts were to have some large-scale PvE boss or bosses that basically, they're indestructible from a game perspective, but from a lore perspective, they are the apocalypse themselves. Think of something like an Age of Dragons, and how you can weave that into the story itself. Suddenly, dragons begin to start coming from the sky and start decimating the entire world, and no matter everybody's attempts on actually trying to save people and trying to save their homes, they know that the only way to escape is through the divine gates. So that could be, the decision of the players and what it is that they need to do from their perspective. Is it a case of, well, they don't really do a lot of combat, they like to trade and everything like that, or they just want to escape and move on to the next world? then that's absolutely fine. Flee to the Divine Gates and allow players to start their journey in their new world, save them from their apocalypse. That's not a problem whatsoever. And you can have this entire event going on for, a week to allow some players to experience it and move on from there as well. And then you've got the other side of it. If a player dies during this transfer event, then they can be saved by the Goddess of Creation, and thus their transfer can begin as well. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, the Goddess of Creation is essentially the phoenix that you see on the logo, on the start of any of Intrepid's videos or anything like that. And that's what happens when your character dies. When your character dies, they turn to ash, and then they are reborn, very much like a phoenix. The phoenix is the Goddess of Creation. The Goddess of Creation could have saved them, and instead of reanimating them in the world that they're currently in, that's at the point where they either merge to the new server or get to choose a new server. There's various different mechanics that we can also stop and start within this scenario as well. People can have PvP stopping, NPCs can begin panicking and leaving populated areas. Quests themselves should just generally stop, and there should only be one quest left, survive or die. And that's how it's going to be. Don't have it as some kind of large-scale PvP event where everyone's just going to kill everyone for no reason because it's fun. And I'm not saying, don't stop that. Allow PvP if that's what the community wants. That would be me going into a little bit of what Quicksilver's concept had, and the fact that maybe you should load up all of your items and stuff into a caravan and then start moving it towards the Divine Gates. Of course, Quicksilver themselves said, turn PvP off for this, but there was a lot of people who are advocating to keep it on, have that level of piracy and protection gameplay itself. Of course, you'll have to leave all your land behind, like a freehold, because that's what's going to happen, especially with a merge. If you're merging into another server, that server is already going to be established. So you can't just pick up a freehold and just place it wherever. That's not going to work. What should really happen is you should have the monetary value back from the freehold or any other buildings that you may own, or anything that you couldn't take with you but still had monetary value to it, so that when you start your new journey, you begin your new journey with this wealth and you're trying to figure out what to spend it on, where you can live, and all of that fantastic stuff that Ashes is going to offer. And then after all of this going on, I think one of the most important things is to allow other players to know that you are part of an apocalypse event. Whether or not that's like a new title to players that have survived it or even died during it and have been reanimated, what it will do is it will just give complete continuity of your story and your character's story, and still give you a sense of accomplishment and depth to your character without just shutting the server down and feeling like everything you've been working towards might have been for nothing. Now, another apocalypse-like event that can really have an impact on players, it could be a time-sensitive situation. So, for example, the end of the world is going to happen in a set amount of time, 1 week, 2 weeks from now. The Vec have gazed upon an asteroid that is plummeting into Vera and have predicted the point of impact. That would make sense from a lore perspective because the Vec are stargazers. Now, players are required to pack everything they can in order to transfer everything through the Divine Gate to take to the next world. Very similar to what Quicksilver has said as well. This concept will use various different game mechanics like the trading system, and also it seems a little bit more suited to PvP in comparison to my last concept. There's that level of protection and piracy that I mentioned before, and it could be a massive element to this apocalypse itself, because let's face it, where there's tragedy, there's always going to be people who are trying to gain off of other people's misfortune. If players are successful in actually escaping to the Divine Gates, they could have more of a monetary value for their goods and holds and everything that they weren't able to take with them. Essentially, they participated in the event, thus they get a little bit more money. Now, overall, that's just the incentive to actually have people play during that time. If they don't play, they just get a normal monetary value. And then the increased monetary value is not really that much. You may be talking a percentage or a certain amount of in-game currency to give to these players as a reward and incentive to experience this itself. You want to give the players something without actually destroying a new economy that the players are going into. And during this time as well, you can have NPCs who are giving people missions to maybe take some stuff to the Divine Gates. You know, for example, hello adventurer, can you please take my goods to the Divine Gates? That's a quest that is very simple in its nature, but still gives you a little bit of lore and immersion into, you know, the situation of what's going on. All while, the later and later, the larger and larger the asteroid becomes from the sky, and you'll be able to see it for that time as well, as will all of the other players. Thus increasing immersion and really getting the players involved into what's, let's face it, a kind of crap situation of a server being shut down. Of course, players can then stay until the point of impact and can witness the point of impact as well. It could be to a point where all the goods have been transferred and every player is ready to go, but they want to experience the point of impact. Again, going back to the previous concept, the goddess of creation will very much come into play with this situation. Whilst all the NPCs and characters that are still there will die, they will be reanimated into a new server. There isn't a monetary loss here. You would just gain a monetary value back, as is the same with any other player that was unable to participate. So at no point is any player disadvantaged unless it was like a strategic disadvantage. But from a monetary perspective, there is no disadvantages to players who participated and players who did not. Now, these are just two of many different ways server merging can become a better experience for players. I mean, like I've said multiple times, server merging and losing personal progress is never fun. Give us an in-game reason as to why it had to happen. Not just a message of saying, hey, guess what? The server's closing. No, a reason as to why it's closing. Yes, the server's closing, but the apocalypse event will start. In my opinion, this will go a long way to keeping those players immersed and continuing the history of the players. There's also nothing stopping other world's news outlets and histories journals to note about these events as refugees arrive, which would be really interesting. There's information on the wiki about having a log for the entire server ever since the server started. How interesting would it be to know how many times there was a server merge through simple news outlets saying that refugees began to arrive from another dimension or another world or another universe? It would just give rich history to what's actually happened and what the entire community of that particular server has been through. And to me, I feel like this is just a much better way of tackling server merges. What do you think? I think is the most important thing. I know there's going to be people who are going to say, well, it doesn't really matter because not a lot of people are going to experience it itself. But what about if it was you? If your server was shutting down, answer me this. Do you just want a message? Or do you want something in-game to actually do about it and have that experience and have that little bit of lore and that history that you can think back on 6 months down the line where you thought, okay, I'm now settled into this world and I really enjoyed this new world, but how brilliant from a story perspective was the apocalypse that got me here? So give that a think, let me know what you think, and then, of course, I will catch you on the next one. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye.